The town of Dry Creek sat like a stubborn stain on the vast canvas of the western plains, its church steeple the only thing that seemed to pierce the sky. Sundays brought the whole town to that little whitewashed building, where once the voice of Reverend Samuel Whitfield carried over hymn and prayer, steady as a bell. But now, months after his sudden death, the pews felt quieter, the air heavier. What the people noticed most, however, wasn't the silence of the pulpit. It was the presence of Mary Whitfield, the preacher's widow. Mary was 28, with the kind of beauty that was too striking to go unnoticed and too dignified to be spoken of openly. Her hair was dark as raven feathers, usually pinned tight beneath her bonnet. Her skin carried the porcelain fairness of someone who had been shielded from the sun, though her hands were calloused from years of serving the church and community. The men of Dry Creek knew better than to speak of her charms, and the women pretended not to notice them. But everyone agreed there was something in her presence that unsettled the order of things. Since her husband's passing, Mary had shouldered a burden heavier than most could imagine. She kept the small parsonage behind the church, lived alone, and tended to the needs of the congregation as though duty were her only breath. She swept the wooden floorboards of the chapel until they shone. She taught the children their letters and Bible verses. She brought bread to the sick and folded blankets for the poor. Every action was precise, proper, and godly. Yet beneath the surface a storm brewed, one Mary dared not name, not even in her most private prayers. Grief, of course, was the expected companion of a widow. And Mary played her role well, keeping her face composed, her steps measured, her voice soft and polite. But what none could see was how often she lay awake in the narrow bed of the parsonage, staring at the dark ceiling above. The nights were long and cruel. She remembered the warmth of her husband's hand in hers, the steady rhythm of his sermons, the weight of his Bible on the kitchen table as he studied by lamplight. She remembered, too, the gentleness of his kisses, always chaste, always careful, as though he loved her soul more than her body. And now that he was gone, she was left with both emptiness and hunger. It was a hunger she could not name, for to name it was sin. She was the preacher's widow. She belonged not to herself, but to the memory of a man the town revered. Her desires were not her own. The whispers of the women at Quilting Bees reminded her. Mary is an example for us all, pure, steady, unshaken by worldly temptation. They meant it as praise, but to Mary it felt like chains. On Sundays, she sat on the front pew, her black dress still pressed with mourning creases, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The new preacher, a timid young man named Clark, fumbled his way through sermons. Mary never let her face show the ache she felt when she compared his hesitant words to the fire that once filled the chapel when her Samuel preached. She bowed her head in prayer, though her thoughts often wandered to things she had no right to think. What it might feel like to laugh freely again, to dance, to be held not out of duty but out of unrestrained desire. The children of the town adored her, bringing her flowers in spring and little carved trinkets in winter. She smiled for them, her heart tender, yet deep inside she wondered if she'd ever bear children of her own now that widowhood defined her. The women, meanwhile, kept her close but distant. They visited her parsonage, dropping off pies and preserves, always watching to make sure Mary remained the saintly figure they expected her to be. The men, especially the bachelors and the restless husbands, kept their distance out of fear and respect. To approach the preacher's widow with anything resembling interest would be seen as scandalous, perhaps even blasphemous. Thus, Mary lived in a carefully constructed cage, one she helped build herself. She hid her loneliness beneath layers of black cloth, hid her longing behind polite smiles, and hid her very womanhood behind the title of widow. Only at night, when no one could see her, did the mask slip. Sometimes she pressed her face into her pillow and wept, not only for her dead husband, but for the years of youth and warmth slipping through her fingers. Other times she pressed her hands to her lips, remembering what a kiss once felt like, wondering sinfully if she would ever feel it again. The church bell tolled each morning, and Mary rose as faithfully as any soldier to the call of duty. Yet beneath the calm surface of her life, her heart was restless. She was bound by the memory of her husband, by the judgment of the town, and by her own fear of the desires that burned quietly within her. Dry Creek saw her as holy, untouchable, an emblem of piety, but Mary Whitfield was still flesh and blood, still a woman, still human. She buried her desire deep where no one could find it, Or so she thought. What Mary could not yet know was that life had already set a storm in motion, a storm that would come to Dry Creek in the form of a stranger, a man who carried danger in his stance and fire in his eyes, a drifter who would not let her bury her desire any longer. The morning sun rose over Dry Creek in a haze of gold, spilling across the dusty main street where wagons rattled and shopkeepers swept their thresholds. The blacksmith's hammer rang like a heartbeat. Horses stamped in the hitching posts, their tails flicking at the persistent flies. It was the same rhythm as every day before, predictable, safe, small. But on this particular morning, the routine would be broken. The town was about to gain a new shadow. From the east came the faint sound of hooves, steady and unhurried. At first, no one paid much mind. Travelers often cut through Dry Creek, stopping only for water or whiskey before moving on. But as the rider drew closer, heads began to turn. He was tall in the saddle, his frame lean but strong, shoulders squared like a man accustomed to carrying more than just a saddlebag. His hat sat low over his eyes, shading a face carved by sun and wind. With the unshaven jaw of someone who had long since stopped caring about society's niceties, the horse beneath him was a rangy bay with scars along its flank, a beast that had clearly seen gunfire and long roads. The man rode with the loose ease of one who trusted no one but his horse, one hand resting near the worn handle of a revolver strapped to his hip. By the time he reached the center of town, the air had grown taut. The blacksmith paused mid-swing. The women outside the mercantile clutched their baskets a little tighter. A boy ran off to tell his father a stranger had arrived. That was the nature of Dry Creek. New faces were rare, and new faces with the look of a drifter stirred curiosity like nothing else. He dismounted slowly, boots raising little puffs of dust as they hit the ground. His eyes swept over the storefronts, over the people staring at him, and finally over the steeple of the little church. The corner of his mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Name's Cole Turner," he said finally, his voice low and edged, the kind of voice that carried both danger and weariness. He didn't say it to anyone in particular, just loud enough for the air itself to hear. Cole walked with the confidence of a man who had lived his life on the edge of law and lawlessness. Some in town recognized the type immediately. A drifter, maybe an outlaw, maybe just a man running from something no one else could see. He tied his horse at the saloon and stepped inside, where the smell of whiskey, smoke, and regret hung heavy. The bartender, polishing a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass itself, gave him a hard look. "We don't get many strangers in Dry Creek." Cole placed a coin on the bar without answering. The sound of silver was enough to earn him a drink. He downed it in one swallow and set the glass back down, his eyes scanning the room. A few card players at the far table froze when his gaze swept over them. It was a look that measured men, weighed them, and dismissed them. Word of his arrival spread quickly, and before long the whispers reached the parsonage. Mary Whitfield, who was at that moment sweeping the chapel floor, heard the creak of the door behind her. She turned, expecting one of the church women. Instead, it was a young boy, breathless with excitement. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "a stranger's come. Looks like trouble. Folks say he's staying a while." Mary's heart gave a strange flutter she couldn't explain. Trouble was a word she had no business entertaining. Yet some part of her, buried deep beneath years of duty, stirred with curiosity. She pressed a hand against her skirt, steadying herself. "Go on home now, child," she told him gently. "Your mother will be waiting." When the boy scurried off, Mary stood alone in the quiet chapel. She told herself it didn't matter who came or went through town. It wasn't her concern. Yet when she returned to sweeping, her hands trembled ever so slightly. That evening, Cole Turner made his presence known once more. He walked the length of the main street, his spurs clinking, his shadow stretching long in the fading sun. People watched from porches and windows, their conversations hushed. He paused near the church, removing his hat, gazing at the steeple as though weighing some private thought. That was when Mary stepped out of the chapel, arms full of hymnals she'd been carrying to the parsonage. Their eyes met for the first time. Mary's breath caught. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with the guarded pity of the townsfolk, not with the polite indifference of the churchwomen. His eyes were sharp, piercing, as though he saw past her black dress, past her folded hands, past the widow everyone else defined her as. He looked at her as though she were simply a woman. Mary quickly lowered her gaze, clutching the books tighter. "Good evening," she murmured, her voice steady despite the quickening of her pulse. Cole tipped his hat in reply, but said nothing. The corner of his mouth curved again into that half-smile, and then he walked on, leaving behind the faint trace of dust and something far more dangerous, the stirring of Mary Whitfield's hidden desire. The town would talk. They always did. But for Mary, that single look was enough to ignite something she had fought to bury for months. She told herself it was foolishness that the stranger would be gone by morning, and yet deep in her chest her heart whispered otherwise. Dry Creek was a place that prized its order. The blacksmith rose at dawn, the schoolteacher rang her bell promptly at 8, and the church stood as the beating heart of it all. People worked, worshipped, and whispered, never too loudly, but always enough to make sure everyone knew everyone else's business. And now, with the arrival of Cole Turner, the town's rhythm felt shaken, its quiet seams stretched thin. By the second day, the whispers had settled into warnings. The mayor's wife, Mrs. Fletcher, fanned herself vigorously as she told anyone who would listen. "That man's a gun hand if I ever saw one. He'll bring trouble to our doorsteps." The store clerk swore he saw scars on the drifter's knuckles, proof of barroom brawls. The saloon girls giggled nervously, trading rumors about the way his eyes followed people, sharp, watchful, like a hawk circling prey. Mary Whitfield heard the whispers too, though she pretended not to. She had enough burdens of her own to bear without entertaining idle gossip. Yet she could not entirely ignore the truth. She had seen the man's eyes herself, and the memory lingered like a secret she dared not share. That evening, she found herself walking through the town square after delivering food to an ailing family. The air was cool, the sky painted in streaks of violet and rose as the sun sank. She should have gone straight home, but her feet slowed when she saw him. Cole Turner leaned against the post outside the livery stable, his hat tipped low, a piece of straw between his teeth. He looked as though he belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once, comfortable in his solitude yet aware of every movement around him. Mary's heart gave a traitorous flutter. She told herself to keep walking, to avoid the man entirely. But as fate, or perhaps temptation, would have it, his gaze lifted and caught hers before she could turn away. "Evenin', ma'am," he said, his voice calm but weighted, as though each word carried the weight of a past he didn't care to speak of. Mary swallowed. "Good evening, Mr. Turner." He pushed himself off the post, closing the space between them with the kind of slow confidence that made her pulse quicken. "Didn't reckon a place like this would have someone like you." The words startled her, not for their forwardness, but because of the way they stripped her of the invisible veil she had been hiding behind. He wasn't speaking to the preacher's widow. He wasn't speaking to the emblem of piety Dry Creek adored. He was speaking to Mary, just Mary. She drew herself up, folding her hands before her as if that would keep them steady. "I'm sure you're mistaken. I'm only the preacher's widow. Nothing more." His eyes narrowed, almost amused. "That so? Funny thing, ma'am, I don't believe it. A widow, sure, but nothing more. No, I've seen the way you look at the horizon. A person don't look at the horizon like that unless they're wishing for something out there." Mary felt her cheeks burn. "You presume too much, sir. I belong here. My place is with the church, with my husband's memory." Cole tilted his head, studying her in silence for a long moment. Then he said softly, "You belong to yourself. Don't forget that." The words struck her like a hammer against fragile glass. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, suddenly desperate to retreat. "Good night, Mr. Turner." But even as she walked away, her steps quick and uneven, her heart betrayed her. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt alive. Alive in a way that frightened her as much as it thrilled her. The next Sunday, the church was full. The congregation prayed, sang hymns, and endured another fumbling sermon from young preacher Clark. Mary sat at the front as always, her hands folded, her face serene. But when the service ended and the people filed out, she felt the burn of eyes on her. Turning slightly, she saw him, Cole Turner, leaning against the hitching post across the street, his hat tilted back just enough for his gaze to meet hers. The town noticed. The whispers sharpened. Mrs. Fletcher's fan snapped furiously as she muttered, "The preacher's widow ought to guard herself better. A woman in her position should set an example." Mary heard the words. She felt their sting, yet when she walked back to the parsonage, she carried with her not shame but confusion. A battle raged inside her. between the role she was meant to play and the desires she buried deep. She prayed that night, harder than she had in months. She prayed for strength, for clarity, for forgiveness. And yet when she closed her eyes, it was not the face of her late husband she saw. It was the drifter's piercing gaze, his voice reminding her, "You belong to yourself." The town wanted her to believe otherwise. Her conscience demanded restraint. But her heart was beginning to betray her. Dry Creek had never needed much to stir its gossip. A torn hemline, a missed church service, a man seen buying too much whiskey. Any small spark could light a fire of talk that spread from the saloon to the sewing circles. But when it came to Mary Whitfield, the preacher's widow, the town's watchfulness was doubled. She was the woman they held up as an example of purity, the one meant to embody patience, restraint, and unwavering faith. For her to so much as share a glance with a stranger was enough to set tongues wagging, and share a glance she had. By Monday morning, the whispers were everywhere. Mrs. Fletcher, wife of the mayor and self-appointed guardian of Dry Creek's moral order, wasted no time in warning others. "I saw it with my own eyes," she declared to a cluster of women at the Mercantile. "That drifter, Cole Turner they call him, standing across from the church like a wolf eyeing lambs. And who do you think he fixed his gaze upon? Our dear Mary." The women clucked their tongues, some with pity, others with disapproval. "Poor thing," one murmured. "She must be lonely." Another added more sharply, "Loneliness is no excuse for sin." The men were no better. At the blacksmith's forge, two ranch hands exchanged knowing looks. "That preacher's widow ought to be careful," one said. "A woman like her don't need to be keeping company with a man like him. Folks will start to wonder." "Wonder," the other snorted. "They already are." Mary, of course, heard fragments of these whispers wherever she went. She could feel the weight of eyes upon her when she walked to the market, or tended to her duties at the chapel. It was as though every step she took was being measured, every breath recorded for judgment. Yet what tormented her most was not the town's suspicion, but her own heart. She had prayed nightly for strength, begged God to still the restless longing within her, and still when she closed her eyes she saw him, the drifter with the piercing eyes and the voice that had told her she belonged to herself. One afternoon, as she knelt in the chapel scrubbing the wooden floorboards, she heard the door creak open. She looked up to see Mrs. Fletcher entering, her expression pinched tight, her gloved hands clasped before her. "Mrs. Fletcher," Mary said politely, rising to her feet, "what brings you here?" The older woman's eyes darted around the chapel before settling firmly on Mary. "My dear, I come as a friend. There are concerns I feel obliged to bring to your attention." Mary folded her hands before her, bracing herself. "Concerns?" Mrs. Fletcher stepped closer, lowering her voice as though the rafters themselves might carry her words to others. "About this man, Cole Turner. You've been seen speaking with him. He lingers near you, and while I do not doubt your virtue, Mary, the town will not be so forgiving. You must understand your position. You are the preacher's widow. An example to all. Any association with a man of his reputation could undo everything your husband built." Mary's throat tightened. She wanted to say that it had only been a few words, that she had done nothing improper, that she remained faithful to her husband's memory. But deep inside, she knew such defenses would be lies, not lies of action but of desire. For though she had not sinned in deed, her heart was stirring with longings she could not confess. "I assure you," Mary said quietly, "my devotion to the church and to Samuel's memory has not wavered." Mrs. Fletcher gave a thin smile, though her eyes remained sharp. "See that it doesn't. Dry Creek is a small place, Mary. People remember. People talk, and once a woman's name is tarnished, it is near impossible to cleanse it again." With that, she swept out of the chapel, leaving Mary standing alone, her rag still damp in her hands. That night, Mary sat at her kitchen table long after the lamp had burned low. Mrs. Fletcher's words echoed in her ears. The preacher's widow. An example to all. It was the same phrase she had heard for months. The title pressed upon her like a brand she could never escape. She thought of Samuel then, her late husband, the man of faith who had loved her with patience and gentleness. He had been a good man, a righteous man. Yet as she remembered his sermons, his careful kisses, his steady presence, a terrible truth pressed upon her heart. She had never burned for him the way she burned now, thinking of the drifter's eyes upon her, Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She pressed her hands to her face, whispering prayers that dissolved into sobs. And yet, in the quiet of the night, beneath the weight of judgment and duty, another whisper rose inside her. Not a prayer, but a longing. A voice that asked, what if Mrs. Fletcher is right? What if the town condemns me? What if they never forgive me? The answer came like a dangerous flame. Would it matter if for once I lived not as the preacher's widow but as Mary? The storm came suddenly, as storms often did across the plains. One moment the sky was calm. The next it was swallowed by dark clouds rolling in from the west. Dry Creek huddled beneath the roar of thunder, shutters pulled tight, lanterns glowing faintly against the wind's howl. The little church, fragile as it looked against the fury of the heavens, creaked under the weight of the storm. Mary Whitfield had not planned to be there that evening. She had intended to stay safe in her parsonage, a book of psalms in her lap while the rain lashed at the windows. But when the wind began tugging at the shingles of the chapel roof, she knew she couldn't leave it to chance. The church was Samuel's legacy. It was her duty. So, lantern in hand, she braved the downpour to check the building. Inside, the chapel was dim and solemn, the lantern light casting long shadows across the pews. Rain hammered the roof above, and with every gust of wind, she feared the old timbers might give way. She climbed up into the loft to peer through the leaking boards, heart thudding as water seeped down. She was struggling to brace a loose beam when she heard the door slam below. "Who's there?" she called, startled, her voice trembling against the thunder. Bootsteps echoed on the floorboards, slow and steady. A familiar voice answered, low and rough. "Easy, ma'am. Didn't mean to frighten you. It was him, Cole Turner." Mary's breath caught. She gripped the lantern tighter as he appeared at the bottom of the loft ladder, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his shirt plastered to his frame. "What are you doing here?" she asked, forcing her voice to sound steady. "Same as you," he said simply. "Saw the roof was coming loose. Figured it needed fixing." Before she could protest, he was already climbing up, his strong hands steady against the worn wood. He joined her in the loft, his presence filling the narrow space. Together they wrestled with the beam, his shoulder brushing against hers as thunder cracked overhead. She felt his warmth even through the chill of the storm. When at last the beam was secured and the rain no longer poured through so fiercely, they sank onto the loft floor, both catching their breath. The lantern flickered between them, painting his features in gold and shadow. Mary folded her hands in her lap, trying to compose herself. "You shouldn't be here. People will talk if they know." "Let 'em talk," Cole said, his eyes fixed on her. "They already do." She looked down, shame prickling her cheeks. "I'm the preacher's widow. I have a duty to Samuel's memory, to the church, to this town. I cannot be seen with you." His gaze softened, but his voice was firm. "You're more than a memory, Mary. More than a title. You've been living for everyone else. What about you? What do you want?" The question struck her like a blow. She had never allowed herself to answer it, not truly. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "I want to be good. I want to be what they expect me to be." "And is that the truth?" Cole asked quietly, leaning closer. "Or is that the lie you've been telling yourself, so you don't have to feel what's burning inside you?" Mary's eyes lifted to his then, and she felt stripped bare. He could see it, the longing she had hidden from everyone, even herself. Her breath came shallow, her heart pounding. "You don't understand," she whispered. "If I admit what I feel, if I allow it, I'll lose everything." Cole's hand moved, slow and steady, until his fingers brushed hers. "Then lose it, because keeping it's been killing you." Her throat tightened, her eyes stinging with tears. For months she had held herself in chains, bound by grief, duty, and judgment. And here was this man, dangerous and free, daring to break them with nothing more than words and the fierce honesty in his eyes. The lantern flickered. Thunder growled, and for a long moment they sat in silence, the storm raging around them while another storm built between them. Finally, in a voice raw and trembling, Mary confessed what she had never dared say aloud. "I'm lonely," she whispered. "So lonely I can hardly breathe at night. I pray and I serve and I smile, but inside I ache. And it frightens me how much I want. More." The words left her trembling, her face buried in her hands as if ashamed of the confession. Cole didn't mock her, didn't pity her. Instead, he lifted her hands gently from her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes burned with something fierce and undeniable. "There's nothing sinful about wanting to live," he said. "There's nothing wrong in wanting to feel. You're not a ghost, Mary, you're a woman." Her breath caught, her lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. The truth of his words seared her more than the storm ever could. For the first time since Samuel's death, Mary felt seen, not as a widow, not as a saintly figure, but as a woman of flesh and longing. And in that moment, by candlelight and thunder, the walls she had built around her heart began to crumble. The storm had passed by morning, leaving Dry Creek washed clean, its dirt streets glistening with puddles, its air fresh with the scent of wet earth. But inside Mary Whitfield's chest, the storm had not passed. If anything, it raged fiercer. She had lain awake the entire night after her confession to Cole Turner. The words she had spoken, "I'm lonely, I ache, I want more," echoed like a hymn of shame and longing. No one had ever heard such weakness from her lips before, no one but him. And instead of condemning her, he had answered with something far more dangerous: understanding. For days, Mary avoided him. She told herself it was necessary, that the town already whispered enough. She buried herself in chores, washing linens, visiting the sick, teaching the children their scripture. Outwardly, she was the same calm, dutiful widow. But beneath her black dress, beneath the veil of composure, her heart pounded whenever she sensed him nearby. And he was nearby. She would catch glimpses of him at the edge of town, mending fences for the ranchers or sharing a quiet drink at the saloon. He was never loud, never reckless in public. But his presence lingered like smoke, impossible to ignore. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the chapel bells finished tolling, Mary carried a basket of leftover bread to the parsonage. She thought the streets empty, the town settling into its nighttime rhythm. But as she stepped past the edge of the chapel, she froze. Cole was waiting. He leaned against the rail of the chapel steps, his hat tipped back, his eyes fixed on her with that same piercing intensity that had unraveled her before. Mary clutched the basket tighter. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice clipped, formal. "You shouldn't be here." "Maybe not," he answered. "But I am." She swallowed hard, glancing around. "If anyone sees us, they already do," he interrupted. "Doesn't matter if I stand here or a mile down the road. Folks have their minds made up. They'll whisper either way." His words struck like truth always did, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She lowered her gaze, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Why do you keep lingering near me?" "Because," Cole said softly, stepping closer, "you're the only thing in this town that doesn't feel hollow." Mary's breath caught. She tried to step back, but the chapel wall pressed against her shoulders. He stood before her now, close enough that she could smell the faint mix of rain and leather clinging to him. "Mr. Turner," she said again, but her voice trembled, betraying her. "This is wrong. I can't." His voice dropped lower, rougher. "Or won't." Her lips parted, but no words came. She could feel the heat of him, the wildness he carried, so unlike the careful, pious love she had known before. And in that charged silence, he reached for her hand. His fingers brushed hers, calloused, firm, insistent. The contact sent a shiver rushing up her arm. A jolt she hadn't felt in years. Mary tried to pull back, but he caught her hand, held it tight, and in that unguarded moment, he leaned forward, his lips pressed against hers. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was fire, raw, fierce, forbidden. A kiss that stripped away widowhood and duty and shame all in a single breath. Mary gasped, her basket tumbling from her arms, forgotten. Her hands pressed weakly against his chest at first as if to push him away. But then her resistance faltered, the world tilted. Her body betrayed her. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. The hunger she had buried deep, smothered under grief and duty, flared to life. Her lips answered his, desperate and trembling, as though her very soul had been waiting for this moment. When at last he drew back, his breath hot against her cheek, Mary stood trembling, her heart racing so fast she thought it might break free of her chest. Her lips burned, her entire being aflame. She stared at him, wide-eyed, torn between terror and desire. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Cole's hand brushed her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin with startling gentleness. "I only reminded you you're alive." Mary staggered back, pressing her hand to her lips as if she could erase the fire still lingering there. No, this cannot happen. I cannot be this woman." But even as she fled into the parsonage, slamming the door behind her, she knew the truth. She already was that woman, Alone in her room, she collapsed onto her bed, her breath ragged, her body trembling. She pressed her pillow to her lips, trying to smother the memory, but it was no use. The kiss lingered, wild, searing, unforgettable. And deep inside, beneath her fear and shame, Mary knew one terrifying, glorious truth. She wanted more. The kiss had changed everything. Mary Whitfield had thought she could bury it, pretend it never happened, hide it away as just a moment of weakness. She prayed through the night, wept into her pillow, and begged the Lord to forgive her. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she felt Cole's lips again, burning her like a brand she could not wash away. But in a town like Dry Creek, secrets never stayed secret for long. 2 days later, the whispers began. It started with Mrs. Abigail Harper, the mayor's wife, who prided herself on knowing everyone's business. She had seen the widow near the chapel steps that evening. Her basket dropped in the mud, her cheeks flushed red. She hadn't seen Cole's lips pressed to Mary's. But she didn't need to. Abigail's imagination was more than willing to fill in the gaps. By the following Sunday, the whispers had grown into a storm. Mary arrived at the chapel in her black dress, her veil pinned perfectly, her Bible pressed against her chest like armor. She had practiced her smile in the mirror, calm and composed, determined not to betray her shame. But the moment she stepped through the door, she felt it, the weight of eyes, the hush of voices falling silent, the judgment thick in the air. She walked down the aisle, each step heavy, each gaze cutting her like a blade. She sat in the front pew, alone as always, but this time it felt different. She was no longer the preacher's widow to them, the saintly figure they had placed on a pedestal. She was something else now, something dangerous. After the service, the elders called her aside. "Mrs. Whitfield," said Elder Grant, his beard long and white, his voice stern as a gavel. "We have heard troubling reports. It is said that you've allowed yourself to keep company with that man." Mary's hands trembled around her Bible. "Mr. Turner has shown me kindness," she said carefully. "Nothing more. Kindness?" Elder Grant's eyes narrowed. "A drifter with no God, no roots, no respect for the good people of Dry Creek? That is not kindness, it is temptation, and it will bring shame upon this church, upon your late husband's memory, and upon you." Mary's breath caught. Her late husband? They always invoked his name as though she were not a woman anymore, only a vessel of his memory, as though her duty was to remain frozen forever in grief, a monument to his piety. "I have done nothing sinful," she whispered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. Elder Grant leaned closer, his voice low and cutting. "Be careful, Mary. A preacher's widow should be a model of holiness. The town looks to you as an example. If you continue down this path, you risk more than gossip. You risk losing the respect and the protection this community offers." She bowed her head, her heart pounding. "Yes, Elder." But even as she spoke, a flicker of rebellion burned inside her. Protection? Respect? Was that what this cage was called? She thought of Cole, of the way he had looked at her, not as a widow, not as a symbol, but as a woman. And despite the fear curling in her stomach, she could not bring herself to regret the kiss. By the time Mary stepped back into the sunlight, the town's whispers had grown louder. Women huddled on porches, men spat tobacco and shook their heads. Children pointed and giggled. The widow's name, once spoken with reverence, now carried a bitter edge. That evening, as Mary walked home, she saw him. Cole leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon, his hat low over his eyes. When he noticed her, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't look at me," she said quickly, her voice sharp, though her eyes betrayed her longing. "The town already talks enough." "Let them talk," Cole answered, his voice calm, steady. "They'll talk whether we give them reason or not." "You don't understand," she whispered, stepping closer despite herself. "They'll ruin me. They'll tear me apart piece by piece. To them, I'm not allowed to feel, to want." Cole's gaze softened. "Maybe it's time you stopped living for them." The word sent a shiver through her, dangerous and liberating all at once. But before she could answer, Mrs. Harper passed by, her eyes narrowing, her lips pursed like a blade. Mary's cheeks flushed hot, shame and defiance warring inside her. That night, Mary sat by her window, staring out at the moonlit street. The town was against her now. She had been cast from her pedestal, dragged down into the dirt. And though it terrified her, a strange sense of freedom whispered through her veins. They had already condemned her. Perhaps then, She had nothing left to lose. The trouble came at dusk. Mary Whitfield had just finished closing the chapel, her hands lingering on the heavy wooden doors as though she could press her worries into the grain and leave them there. The whispers, the judgment, the endless weight of eyes, it was all suffocating her. She wanted quiet, and for a fleeting moment, the silence of the sanctuary had given her peace. But outside, the world was shifting. Cole Turner stood at the edge of town, rolling a cigarette between his fingers but not lighting it. His eyes scanned the horizon with the restlessness of a man who knew danger never stayed far. He had lingered in Dry Creek longer than he should have, long enough to stir trouble in the heart of a widow, long enough to draw the attention of those he'd once called his own. And sure enough, trouble arrived in the form of 3 riders cresting the ridge. Dust rose around them like a shroud as they approached. Hard men with cruel faces, guns hanging loose at their hips. The leader, a scarred brute named Dalton Briggs, spat into the dirt as he reined in his horse. "Well, I'll be damned," Dalton drawled. "If it ain't Cole Turner alive and breathing. Thought you'd be rotting in some ditch by now." Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "Dalton, you got a lot of nerve showing your face," Dalton continued, his eyes glinting with malice. "After what you pulled back in Abilene." Mary, standing halfway down the street with her basket of hymnals, froze. She recognized the tone of men who thrived on violence, though she didn't yet understand the history between them. Cole finally lit his cigarette, inhaling slow. "That was a long time ago. You boys still sore about it?" Dalton's grin widened. "You double-crossed us, ran off with the money and left 2 men bleeding. You think time washes that away?" Mary's breath caught. Her heart hammered as the words sank in, double-cross, money, blood. She looked at Cole, the man who had kissed her with fire, the man who had spoken to her soul. Could it be true? Was he nothing more than an outlaw hiding behind a pair of steady eyes? Dalton leaned forward in the saddle, his voice low and threatening. "We ain't here for talk, Turner. We're here to settle." The saloon doors banged open, townsfolk spilling into the street. Guns glinted in the setting sun. Fear rippled through Dry Creek, but under it was curiosity. The town had always known Cole was trouble. Now they had proof. Mary felt dozens of eyes turn to her. Her throat went dry. She realized with a sinking heart that everyone knew. They had seen her glance toward him, seen the flicker of fear and something more on her face. The widow was tied to the drifter now, whether she wanted it or not. Cole flicked his cigarette into the dirt and ground it beneath his boot. His hand hovered near his gun, but his gaze cut briefly to Mary. Just a flicker, but she saw it. Regret, apology, and something deeper. "Dalton," Cole said evenly, "I'm not looking for blood. You want revenge, take it, but don't drag this town into it." Dalton laughed, a harsh sound. "Still playing the nobleman, huh? That ain't the Cole Turner I remember." Mary's chest tightened. She wanted to scream at them to stop, to run, to leave this cursed town before it was swallowed whole. But her feet were rooted. The first gunshot cracked the evening stillness. Dalton's man drew too quick and Cole answered faster. One outlaw crumpled into the dirt before Mary even realized what had happened. Gasps and screams erupted as townsfolk scattered, doors slammed and shutters closed. Chaos descended on Dry Creek. Mary dropped her basket, hymnals spilling across the ground. Her heart screamed at her to flee, but her eyes refused to leave Cole. He stood steady, gun smoking, facing 2 men who wanted him dead. She saw something then. Something the town never would. Beneath the hardened outlaw, beneath the shadows of his past, there was a man fighting to survive. A man who bore the weight of choices made long ago. Dalton cursed and barked orders, circling with his last man. Cole backed toward the chapel steps where Mary stood trembling. "Get inside," he muttered sharply, his eyes never leaving his enemies. Mary shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "They'll kill you!" "Maybe," Cole said, his voice calm as steel. "But I won't run." For the first time, Mary understood the full weight of what it meant to care for him. The town's outrage was one thing, but this was life and death. And as gunfire cracked through the twilight, she realized with horror that her heart had already chosen. Whether outlaw or savior, sinner or saint, she could not bear to lose him. Dry Creek woke the next morning with smoke still hanging in the air and blood drying in the dirt. The shootout had ended with 1 outlaw dead, another wounded and dragged away, and Dalton Briggs swearing he'd return to finish what he started. Cole Turner had survived, but survival came at a cost. The town now knew without doubt he was a dangerous man, a gunfighter with blood on his hands. And worse, they knew the preacher's widow was tangled in his fate. Mary Whitfield sat by her window as dawn light spilled across her room. She hadn't slept. She had seen it all, the flash of gunfire, the steady calm in Cole's eyes, the hatred burning in Dalton's. She had felt her heart leap with every shot, not because she feared the town's judgment, but because she feared losing him, and that terrified her most of all. By mid-morning, the church elders came knocking. Elder Grant stood at her door with two others, their faces stern, their voices heavy with authority. "Mary Whitfield," Elder Grant began, "the time has come for you to make a choice. This man Turner, he is a criminal, a killer. The entire town has seen it now. If you continue to associate with him, you drag your husband's memory through the mud and shame this congregation. We cannot allow that." Mary's fingers tightened on the edge of her shawl. He defended himself. "You all saw, he did not start the fight." Elder Grant's eyes hardened. "That makes no difference. His kind brings violence wherever they go. If you stand by him, you will be cast out. Your position as a preacher's widow, your protection, your honor, all gone. The people will turn their backs on you." The words struck like hammers. Cast out, alone, stripped of everything her late husband's name had secured for her. For years she had lived in that shadow, safe but suffocated, and now they held it over her like a leash. She bowed her head, her voice trembling. "And if I denounce him? Then," Grant said, his tone softening slightly, "the town will forgive. You will remain one of us. Your husband's legacy will be preserved. But you must put this nonsense behind you and stand on the side of righteousness." When they left, Mary collapsed into her chair, her hands covering her face. The choice lay before her like two roads splitting in the dust. On one side, safety, salvation, the approval of the town. She could repent, pretend the kiss had never happened, banish Cole Turner from her heart, and continue her life as the preacher's widow, untouched, unchallenged, a living monument to piety. On the other, desire, fire. A man who stirred her soul awake, who made her feel alive after years of silence. But choosing him meant exile, shame, and a life lived in the wilderness beyond the town's approval. That evening she found him. Cole sat on the steps of the chapel, hat in his hands, his gun at his side. He looked weary, older somehow, as though the shootout had stripped away the last of his armor. "You shouldn't be here," Mary whispered, glancing around nervously. He gave a tired smile. "You keep saying that, and yet here I am." She sat beside him, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long moment they said nothing. The town around them was quiet, but she could feel eyes watching from behind shutters, from porch swings, from the shadows. "They want me to denounce you," she admitted finally, her voice cracking. "If I do, I keep my place. My husband's memory stays pure. But if I don't—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Cole's jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the horizon where Dalton Briggs had fled. "Mary, I don't want to drag you into my mess. My past, it doesn't leave me. Men like Dalton will keep coming. Best thing I can do is ride out, leave this town, leave you." Her heart twisted. The thought of him leaving cut deeper than all the whispers, all the judgment. "And if you go?" she asked softly. "What happens to me then?" "I'm still ruined in their eyes." His gaze met hers, steady and raw. "Then you're free. Free to start over without me weighing you down." Tears blurred her vision. Free or just empty again? The silence between them stretched long, filled with all the words neither dared to say. Finally, Cole stood, pulling his hat low. "You have a choice to make, Mary. Salvation or me. And I ain't worth your soul." He turned to walk away, but Mary rose too, her voice breaking as it cut through the twilight. "Don't you see? My soul's been dead since the day they buried my husband. You're the first thing that's made me feel alive." Cole froze, his back to her, every muscle rigid. Slowly he turned, his eyes burning with something fierce and unspoken. Mary's breath caught. She realized in that moment that her choice wasn't really between salvation and desire. It was between chains and freedom, between living for a dead man's memory or living for herself. And though terror clawed at her, though the entire town would condemn her, the answer burned in her chest with terrifying clarity. She wanted him, even if it damned her in the eyes of every soul in Dry Creek. Dawn broke over Dry Creek, pale and golden, painting the town in long shadows. The air carried the promise of heat, but in Mary Whitfield's chest there was only fire. The fire of decision, burning hotter than any sun. She had not slept. Her choice had been made in the silence of the night, when she sat at her husband's old desk staring at his Bible. For years, that book had been her anchor. It had given her strength when he died, given her comfort when the town leaned on her grief as if it were their own. But as she traced her fingers over its leather cover, she realized she had never lived for herself. She had lived as a symbol, a statue carved from loss and duty, and she was done. When the church bells tolled that morning, the town gathered. Word had spread that the widow was to make her stance clear, whether she would denounce the drifter or fall with him. Mary dressed not in her mourning black, but in a plain blue dress she had not worn in years, one that spoke not of death but of life. She pinned her hair back, lifted her chin, and walked out her door with steady steps. The townsfolk were waiting. Women lined the porches, whispering behind their fans. Men stood with arms crossed, judgment heavy in their eyes. Children stared wide-eyed, sensing the weight of the moment. And at the chapel steps under the rising sun stood Cole Turner. He looked as though he had already decided his fate. Hat low, gun at his hip, he seemed ready to ride out, to disappear into the horizon without looking back. His eyes, when they lifted to Mary's, carried resignation, as if he expected her to turn away from him in front of them all. But she did not turn. Mary stopped before him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. The elders stood nearby, waiting to hear her denouncement, their faces tight with anticipation. Elder Grant stepped forward. "Mary Whitfield," he said, his voice booming across the gathered crowd. "We ask you plainly, will you preserve your late husband's legacy, stand with your community and cast aside this man who brings violence and shame, or will you choose sin and exile?" The silence was absolute. Even the horses tied to the posts seemed to hold their breath. Mary looked from the elder to the crowd and finally to Cole. He gave the faintest shake of his head, as if begging her not to ruin herself for him. But in his eyes, those weary, scarred eyes, she saw the truth. He wanted her, but he would not ask. He would leave her free. And freedom, Mary realized, was exactly what she craved. She lifted her voice, steady though it trembled beneath the weight of years. "For too long," she began, "I have lived not as myself but as a shadow. I have worn the name of the preacher's widow like chains. I have bowed to your judgment, your whispers, your rules. But I am not just a widow. I am a woman, and I will not live in your cage any longer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elder Grant's face darkened. "Mary, think of your husband's memory." "I have thought of it," she cut in, her voice sharp as a whip. "And I honor him by living, not by burying myself beside him. My soul is my own, and I will not be judged by men who know nothing of it." Before fear could claim her, Mary turned to Cole. She reached for him with trembling hands, lifted his face to hers and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was fierce, blazing, a declaration to the world. It was not the stolen, desperate kiss of before, but a choice, her choice. Her lips burned with it, her heart soared with it, her very soul lit up like fire. The crowd gasped, some shouted, some turned away in horror, but Mary did not hear them. All she felt was the truth of him, the man who had reminded her she was alive. When she finally drew back, she kept her hand in his, her gaze steady on the furious elders. "I choose him. I choose me. If that damns me in your eyes, so be it." The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in shock, a few in silent admiration. The elders turned their backs, muttering about exile, about shame. But Mary no longer cared. Cole's hand tightened in hers. "Mary," he whispered, his voice rough, "you know what this means. They'll never forgive you. You'll be cast out." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Then let them cast me out. I would rather walk into the wilderness with you than rot in their cage." For a moment his hardened mask slipped. Emotion flickered across his face, surprise, tenderness, awe. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a vow without words. Together they turned from the chapel steps. The town still shouted, still judged, still burned with outrage. But for Mary Whitfield, the noise had faded. Her soul, once bound in grief and duty, was alight with fire. She was no longer the preacher's widow. She was a woman reborn, her heart claimed by a drifter, her desire no longer hidden but blazing. And as they walked side by side into the uncertain horizon, Mary felt no fear. For the first time in years, she felt only freedom. Her soul burned and she welcomed the flames.